I can certainly see and hear you. Yes, Julie.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Our apologies for the delayed start. We've had several technical issues, including a faulty laptop, a collapsing Zoom. We have our presenter, we have our slides. So my apologies for the slightly delayed start there. We are joined this evening by Mr. Jon Sharp, who's a consultant solicitor at Fletcher Day, and he's going to be doing for us, or talking to us about an update on his very popular series last year, COVID-19 versus the insurer's response. There's been lots going on. Business interruption claims are started to go through. So Jon thought it would be a timely thing to do to bring us up to speed with what's been going on. Unfortunately, because of these technical issues, I'm going to have to run the slides. So bear with us while I just get that up and running, and then Jon will be able to stun and amaze you all.
I wouldn't
Jon,
quite go that far.
See those slides? Can you see the slides?
No, I can't see this. Oh, yes, I can now.
Jon, can you see the slides?
I can, yes.
Excellent. Right. Okay, let's go. So just as always, if there's any questions for
Ladies and
Jon,
gentlemen, I do apologise. We're normally much slicker than this. I also apologise for not being once again in a shirt and tie. But as you know, it's been a very hot day, and I really couldn't. And I've had to travel to Durham unexpectedly, hence the very attractive background that I have at the moment. So I do apologise, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, go, Julie. We'll have slide 2 now. Yes, thank you. We can ignore him. Number 3. Right. This seminar addresses insurance issues. Generally, everyone's policy wording will differ. More about that later. It's as accurate as it can be given the consistently changing situation. I can't address specific issues. Speak to your broker, lawyer, or other advisor. Or, but, get the idea. Quick run through the agenda. We are going to start from the beginning because those that haven't been on the seminar before will want to understand how this arose, what it is, what caused the very significant anger that's directed against insurers in relation to business interruption. So we will look at act of God, general information, office policies, force majeure, frustration, the insurance market's approach, mitigation and site closure for those in the construction industry, quick look at travel insurance, recent developments, and then the FCA business interruption insurance case. Next slide, Julie. Next slide, Julie. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Right. The virus outbreak was not an act of God. There was much speculation at the time that it would be, but it wasn't. Possible causes, well, I think we all know this now. Consumption of animals outside the food chain, and of course the conspiracy theories abound about whether or not there was a leak of some chemical agent in a Wuhan factory where they had the equivalent of our Perbrite. Those are gathering some momentum at the moment, simply because the Chinese authorities will not basically cooperate at all with any international inquiry. I'm making no further comment other than that. But the current law is set out in the decision of Lord Hobson in Transco PLC against Stockport Metropolitan Borough Council. I've given you the report there. Next slide, Julie. Lord Hobson described an act of God as an event which involves no human agency, is not realistically possible to guard against, is due directly and exclusively to natural causes, and could not have been prevented by any amount of foresight plans and care. Now, just going back to that point, so a typical case would be where you've had a port which has offered shelter to shipping for as long as anyone can remember, and then suddenly, after 100 years or so, that port gets flooded. Could anyone have reasonably foreseen that, etc.? Now that might be described as an act of God, but this pandemic isn't. So what's known about the virus? Well, still very little in terms of causation. There were rumours that it responded to heat, alcohol, but various governments in different countries are putting different measures in order to deal with it. But there has been pretty much a consistent government responses. At first it was containment, and then delay its transmission, and then mitigation, which we all know, we've all chapped now at least 2 or 3 times. But it has to be said on any view that there was a lack of preparation by just about every government in the world. If history teaches us anything, what it does do is that you shouldn't ignore it. So, since 2000, in 2003, we had the SARS outbreak. And in 2005, Ronald Reagan gave a very good speech about this. George Bush gave a very good speech about this, which was unusual for him. But obviously the outbreak in 2003 basically got him a bit worried. And he said that every government should be prepared for this. No government was. Doesn't matter where you are in the world. So there we are. Again, I'm saying nothing further than that, but it's an interesting little talk by George there, and you have the link. Next slide, Julie. Next slide, Julie. Insurance policies generally, well, you have 2 aspects to your insurance cover. You have a cover note. Let's just take it down to the basic principles which we're all familiar with. Take it to renewing your car insurance. You will receive a cover note from your insurance company which says you're covered, you're insured. But that, unfortunately, is only half it. In terms of business interruption and more complicated insurance policies, you will receive a letter from your broker or possibly from your underwriters if you've gone direct, which sets out the basic terms of your cover. You're covered for this, you're covered for that, you're covered for the other. So in the construction industry, you may well be covered for £1 million worth of personal injury cover. Yeah? But unfortunately, that document is not your insurance policy. What you need to do is look behind it and look at your policy wording. So here we have a policy schedule. In fact, this was Silver Ball's policy schedule. And it's our office policy schedule. And it states there in 3 or 4 pages that this is what we're covered for. Maximum cover is, maximum covers that, maximum covers this. All looks brilliant. Until, Julie, next slide. You look at this. This is your policy wording. The previous document was 3 to 4 pages long. This document is something like 60 pages long of close type. But the courts have long said that this is your contract with your underwriters. So the summary of cover is merely evidence that you have got some insurance. But what you're insured for and in what circumstances and in what eventualities is actually in your policy wording. I have said this on numerous occasions and I will repeat myself again. you need to read your policy wording. It is probably the most boring 2 or 3 hours that you will ever spend in your life, but it's important. This is the contract that you enter into between yourselves and your insurers. You need to read it carefully to make sure that it covers you for what you want to be covered for. Next slide, Julie. Julie, next slide. Thank you. Office policies, certainly during the pandemic, they were under scrutiny. Is there cover if you needed to leave your offices? I'll come back to that point slightly later on. However, have you got any alternative? Sorry. Thank you, Jim. There's also a difference between passive cover or intervention cover. Passive cover is fire, theft, some sort of gas explosion. That is cover that's automatically covered by your business interruption policy. It is the standard stuff. You have a fire in your nice new restaurant because a fat fryer, and actually recently we had this exact situation in my local village, Bridge of Allen, when Nick Nairn's restaurant burnt to the ground, or parts of it did. What went wrong? Fat fryer. Will he be covered by business interruption? Well, the answer is probably yes. But the difference with the pandemic was that this was passive. So there was no actual damage to the building. Damage to anyone, it just goes about in the air. So there is a difference between the two. Fire is a classic case where you would expect business interruption policies to apply. Sorry, wasn't my fault. We've had a fire and out of business for 3 to 6 months. Yeah, and insurers deliberately added it. But what insurers increasingly did was add passive cover to effectively, I suppose, sweeten or expand their policy wording in order to get more premium in. Limits on policy improving loss. Yes, of course, every clause, your policy will have a policy limit. There will be an excess and you will still need to prove your loss. Sorry, Julie. Force majeure, again, much talked about, but doesn't actually, was this, it's more or less going back to an active fault. There's no doubt that the coronavirus caused, and is still causing, delays to contractual obligations. And if a contract contains a force majeure, this excuses one or both the parties from performance of the contract is occur. But unfortunately, force majeure has no fixed interpretation in English law. So every case has to be looked at on its own facts. So don't think situations like this are going to go away. You need to plan going forward for what might happen. So if you're going to enter into new contracts, make sure you've got a force majeure clause there, which sets out specifically the circumstances in which it applies. So the clause should also include potential government reactions to outbreaks, such as quarantine measures, closing down large cities, public transport, etc. Now, shipping contracts, very different from construction, have had force majeure clauses there for many years. So it includes government activities, acts of princes or rulers, probably not likely here, import and export bans and restrictions. Think entering into a project whether or not you should have a detailed force majeure clause which sets out clearly the circumstances under which both parties can go, well, hey, we're walking away from this, or that we'll agree to put it on hold for 3 or 4 months. But don't just put the word force majeure in, because it's no definition at all. You need to then set out as well what happens if for both parties agree that force majeure applies. Well, where do we go with this contract? Are we putting it on hold until such time as both parties agree to go forward? So it does need a little bit of drafting, but we've all now been stung. And I think the reality is that people are thinking already, well, that won't happen again. I wouldn't if I were you. In 2003, we had SARS. 2009, we had MERS. 2015, we had something very nasty in China as well. So walking through life now thinking this will not happen again is very naive. So if you're going to enter into major contracts now, especially construction contracts, build a force majeure clause in. Next slide, Julie. The other argument, of course, is that contracts were frustrated. So no applicable force majeure contract. So in the JCT contract, it just says force majeure. Well, fine, but what's that? It's not defined anywhere. Another avenue might be the doctrine of frustration, but the courts have been reluctant for many years to adopt the doctrine of frustration. It's where something completely unforeseen happens to both parties, and it makes it effectively commercially or physically impossible to perform a contract. Now, you can argue that the pandemic slowed down the performance of contracts, but does it frustrate them totally? The answer is probably unlikely. And frustration terminates contracts. It ends them completely. So as I've said, it would be much better when people are drafting new contracts, and especially on JCT contracts, insert the clause that covers circumstances that we've all been through over the last 18 months. Next slide, Julie, thank you. So, did the insurance market come running to all of our aid, given that we've paid for business interruption? Well, I think the answer is we all know it didn't. Now, there's a difference between paying for basic business interruption cover that covers property damage. So go back to the situation I described earlier. Got a restaurant, your fat fry blows up, fine. Sorry, most contracts, even the most basic ones, will cover you for either your loss of revenue or loss of turnover, depending on the wording of your policy, for some sort of business. And that's been long established. A fire, you're out of the office, you're out of your premises for 3 months, fine. But what other types of cover might you have, certainly in the construction industry, for delay and cancellation of contracts? Well, as I've said, obviously we're talking about business interruption clauses. They will be there, but they vary. Their terms are multitudinal. You might, if you had a proper JCT contract and got extended cover, you might get some cover for delay in receipt of essential supplies. You could certainly buy that. Look at your CAR contract. It depends what type of cover you did have. If you took out basic factors or risks, then you may only be covered for the basic risk. But did your broker enhance your cover. All comes down to reading your policy wording. Office exclusion cover is a real bone of contention. I'll come back to that later. Now, what will assist? Now, when I wrote this back in March, April last year, the fact that coronavirus was declared a pandemic and notifiable disease didn't seem actually to be desperately helpful then. But actually, on reflection, it probably is more helpful than it's not. However, the argument that insurers take is that this outbreak is not within the reasonable contemplation of either party when the cover was taken out, and are already restricting the cover offered in policies, excluding cover in relation to viruses, pandemics, notifiable diseases in just about every new insurance contract. Okay. So it's going to be very difficult and expensive to get cover going forward. The professional indemnity market, certainly in the construction industry, it is at its highest that I have ever known. 33 years I've worked in I've never known price hikes like this. There's a number of reasons for that, and I won't bore you with it all today. That's a separate talk that I give on different issues. Thanks, Jules. Can I have the next slide? Now, if you did have one of those policies that included some kind of cover for pandemic and notifiable diseases, then you still have a duty to mitigate your loss. You cannot and never have been able to just close your office, for example, and just walk away. You can't do that. You have to mitigate your loss. You have to try and carry on your business to the best of your ability as much as you can. So let's take a classic example of when you've had a flood in a warehouse. Everything's floating on the floor, etc. What you're expected to do is call the fire brigade, not leave items floating in water, salve what you can. You've got to try your best to have carried on business to the best of your ability. Also, don't forget the notification point. I suspect now it's way too late for anyone to notify business interruption claim. Normally, there are time limits in your policy, 28 days, a month, 3 months, in which to notify insurers of any claim. If you're now trying to notify insurers of a business interruption claim, I suspect you'll fall foul of that. But certainly when I did it, it's a valid point. But going forward, it's also a valid point. If you have got a circumstance or you want to notify, do not leave it. Your duty is to tell your insurers that I think I've got a claim here. Now, the claim may not come to anything. It may well say, well, so-and-so fell off his ladder, but actually turned up to work the next day. He was absolutely fine. He said, sorry, I slipped. No problem at all. I'm fine. But even in those circumstances, the duty is probably to tell your insurers, because insurers can walk away from most policies, even under the new Insurance Act, by simply saying, you didn't tell us. It's too late for us now to investigate or defend the claim. You didn't tell us on time. Also remember that if you do have to shut a site, in particular because of an outbreak of COVID, then you need to tell your insurers. You leaving your offices unattended from, I've said offices because the same issue arose with us. You're leaving a site unattended for more than 30 to 60 days, depending on your policy wording, then you will need to tell your insurers that we can't continue to work on the site, so this is what we've done. Because if there is then an incident on the site, shows that we didn't tell us you'd shut it. So you need to be careful. Next slide, Julie. Travel insurance. I just thought I'd touch on this briefly. It's now extremely unlikely that you'll ever get cover for COVID. There are companies out there that are offering COVID cover, but frankly, the premium's pretty extortionate. Now, if you were fortunate to have a travel policy before the coronavirus pandemic hit, do not cancel. Let the airline or government advice say you can't go. If you cancel, insurance say, well, you cancel, that was your choice. So just be careful. Never do anything voluntarily, because it was your decision to do that. Now, that has been much more, again, when I did that slide, it's now been more than compensated for to some extent, because most airlines are saying, look, if you don't want to go, you can move your flight for free, but you have to obviously pay the additional cost, etc. So you're never going to get away scot-free, but there's more flexibility built into the system as a result. So be careful when you take out new travel insurance. Make sure that it's covering you for everything that it should do. Julia, I've gone up. Oh, right. Now, because there was such, thank you, Julia, because there was such an outcry in relation to the insurance market not paying on business interruption claims, there was a huge outcry. I don't think I've ever seen so many column inches in newspapers dedicated to business interruption. Because what people argued, and with some justification, well, more than some justification, is that over the years we've paid for this, and when actually we need it, it hasn't come forward. Now, as I said, there is a difference between a basic policy that covers you for fire, theft, lightning, aircraft strike, etc., which will probably give you business interruption on the basis that there's been a fire at your premises, etc. And those policies that were much more sophisticated and said, well, we'll also cover you for if your premises are closed by the act of government, if they're closed because there's an outbreak of a pandemic, a disease, etc. Those were all real issues. And people paid more money for wider cover. So the outcry was, well, you've paid this money for the extra cover. It includes notifiable diseases, and yet you're not paying. Such was the outcry that I predicted actually some time ago in March that the FCA would get involved. The government called in insurers and spoke to them all, and it's documented in the first decision, which I'll come on to in a moment. Richie Sunak asked all insurers to come in and basically said, no, come on, chaps, you'll do the decent thing. Yes, well, there we are. They didn't. But then you have the chairman of Lloyd's also encouraging his market to respond appropriately to genuine business interruption claims. But the FCA watched all this quietly in the background and didn't feel that insurers were doing enough. In April of last year, they wrote a letter to all of the chairmen of all of the brokers, said you really should be doing more than you're doing at the moment. And so such was the outcry that eventually they took action, and they took action on a number of policy wordings, which I'll come on to in a moment. In the meantime, however, certain barristers, Jeffrey Gruder, QC at Essex Court Chambers, He has written some very, very interesting pieces on this. His view was that there should be some policies that responded. Next slide, Julie. So, the FCA brought a business interruption case. The background was agreed between the parties. They had basically proceeded on a set of agreed facts. The FCA issued a claim form against, I think it was 8 insurers, and there was something like 17, I think there was 28 policy wordings looked at, because they took these policies because these were the ones that kept coming up all the time. The reason the FCA did it was that the reason is that the FCA regulates the insurance and financial markets. It hates uncertainty. It wants certainty. But such was the outcry that it had to do something anyway. And given the lack of an appropriate response from the insurance market, it didn't feel it had any alternative but to proceed. The mutual objective was to stop multiple pieces of litigation going to the court, asking the court to decide on the same issues again and again. Much easier for the court to look at basically a sample policy wordings, give interpretation in relation to that, and then hopefully things will calm down slightly. There were a number of issues to be determined, but insurers and the FCA agreed what those issues were. There was a full process for agreeing the facts. But a decision was made at first instance by the House of Lords in September of last year, and much of it turned on what's described as the Orient Express case. I'll give you the brief facts. This was all to do with a New Orleans hotel, and it was damaged by a hurricane. And so, quite naturally, and I think it was Hurricane Katrina. So, quite naturally, they expected under normal principles, we've been damaged by a storm, that's one of your basic covers, we want business interruption covered. But the fact is the hurricane was so devastating. Oh, I do apologize. The hurricane was so devastating that the whole of New Orleans was shut. You wouldn't have been able to go to the hotel even if you wanted to. Therefore, the court at the time said, well, no business interruption lies because there was no business, if you like, to interrupt. Now that was set aside by the court and said that's the wrong interpretation of a policy. So predominantly the FCA won. Some insurers got away without any liability being found in their policies, ecclesiastical being one. Others, it was a half and half. So Zurich, there was one policy out of 4 that were examined where it was held that there was some cover. The rest were dismissed. However, Hiscox were found to be liable on just about every policy that they wrote because Hiscox prided itself on having extended coverage and charging higher premium accordingly. So, what should you be doing now? Well, if you haven't already, you should now be making a claim and see what response you get from your insurers. Undoubtedly, all of these will be appealed, and indeed last year it was appealed to the House of Lords, who fast-tracked the appeal. They primarily agreed with the first instance decision, but put certain important caveats on it. They said and made a real distinction between those businesses that were forced by law to close, So pubs, restaurants, etc. If you opened your pub during lockdown, the police would have come round and said, sorry, shut down now. But if you just had a straightforward office and people didn't go to your office, that was to some extent up to them. There was nothing, bizarre though it seems, in law that said you could not go to your office. And this is now becoming a real bone of contention. So is it going to be easy, even though the two decisions, the High Court decision and the Supreme Court decision, are broadly in the favour of policyholders? Is it going to be easy to prove your case? The answer is probably not. You will still have to fight. And then there are the quantum issues. What actually did you lose? How much money did you lose? Can you prove that you lost that amount of money? In terms of the effect on premiums going forward, certainly in the construction industry, it's at its highest ever, and we're still awaiting the Grenfell decision. I can't see this going down any time soon. I think we're going to be in what's called a hard insurance market for the next 3 to 4 years. I may be wrong, and I hope I am, but I can't see much change for the time being. To the next slide. So my conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, out of all of this is that I'm afraid it's actually reasonably simple. You do need to read your policy wording to see if you have got cover for business interruption in the first place. If you have got cover for business interruption, then you need to read exactly what it covers you for. But if you have not made a claim already, then I think probably by now you may be slightly in difficulty. But there is no doubt that you should be at least looking at it and considering it. And myself, my colleague here at Fletcher Day, will be delighted to look at any business interruption claims that you have. We're dealing with a number, and you can contact either myself on jon.sharp@fletcherday.co.uk or Julie, what's Nick's email address?
It's nick.sutton, SUTTON. So it's nick.sutton@fletcherday.co.uk.
Because between the two of us, we will be able to provide you with some solid advice as to that. But do not think that because the House of Lords and the Commercial Court decided for the most part in favour of policyholders that it's a walk in the park. It isn't. It will still be a struggle, especially on the question of how much money have you lost. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, I do apologise for the technical issues we had earlier on. It's neither my fault nor Julie's. Now I am in Durham, possibly that could be it. And I apologise again for not wearing the shirt and tie. It's not like me, but it is so hot today. I'm sorry, I didn't do it. Julie, thank you for persevering, making sure the seminar went ahead, and you're much appreciated as ever. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and all of you. Good evening.
Thank you, John, for that. For those wise words indeed, and yes, our apologies again for the slightly delayed start and the technical issues we've experienced tonight. Hopefully that will not be happening again. We are in fact back to tomorrow evening. We have the construction roundup at 6 p.m. featuring our own Mr. Jon Sharp, Mohammed Haq, and we have a guest tomorrow. Yes, you again. Just when you thought you were safe to go back in the water.
Julie here, you know.
You're so popular. We've also got a guest, Len Bunton, tomorrow, and there'll be several topics under discussion, including CAP, conflict avoidance in practice. If you would like to log in,
the liquidated damages.
And liquidated damages, thank you, John. So if you'd like to log in for that, please contact us on seminars@fletcherday.co.uk. We have 2 seminars next week. Construction Essentials, we'll be talking about termination. That's on Wednesday at 8 a.m. And then the latest in Mohammed Hack's series, Adjudication Matters, where he'll be looking at enforcing or challenging a decision. And that's at 6 p.m. on Thursday. Again, seminars at fletcherday.co.uk if you would like to book a login, book a place and get login details for any of those. Other than that, thank you very much for attending, ladies and gentlemen. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon.
You know, I'm doing the one tomorrow. I'm not doing the 2 next week, am I?
No, John, you're quite safe.
I'm afraid that would have to be victimization.
That would be overload for everybody on Mr. Sharp. Okay,
right,
everyone.
Julie, take care. Good evening.
Yep, you too. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.